Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And today I'm going to show you how to add a temporary banner to the front page of your website. You just add a section, as you can see, and then we're going to do a little scrolling banner here. You'll see why in a minute. I'm going to drag that up to the top of the grid for the section. Now, of course, that leaves a lot of empty space, so I can just go into Edit the section, set it to a small margin in the first place, and then set the rows of the grid down to just the two you need for the scrolling banner. And now it fits neatly above the main picture and the main section of the site. And why am I putting a little scrolling banner? Well, there is going to be a book launch for my new book on HMS Belfast, and it's going to be held on HMS Belfast on the 31st of May 2025. More information to come in the near future. Keep an eye out on the community posts. But I just type that in. I'm going to keep the little divider because I think that looks quite cool. And then I can just save that on the page, and it's all done. There's a few little options. You can see there, pins and edits and so forth. But it really is just that simple. There you go. The website is now updated, and when the book launch is done and I don't want it anymore, I can just go back into edit and delete it really quickly. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. The aftermath of the Channel Dash left the British contemplating a number of things. But one of the foremost was the apparent difficulties involved in attacking ships using torpedo bombers at the midpoint in the war. Thus far, the torpedo bomber had proved to be a significant threat to ships on both sides of the conflict. Yet now a formation of swordfish flown by highly experienced pilots, some of whom had had a hand in the dispatching of Bismarck the previous year, had not only failed to damage the German capital ships, but they'd been comprehensively blown out of the sky. Now, to be fair, there were a number of factors exacerbating this. A small number of attack aircraft, lack of coordination with the fighter escort, and the presence of significant numbers of enemy land-based fighters. However, the German ships' anti-aircraft guns had also taken their toll, and while escort coordination could be resolved, and thus enemy combat air patrol at least contested, the increasing capabilities of enemy anti-aircraft guns were not so easily countered. This was not, however, a new problem for the British. As one of the original leaders in the torpedo bombing field, they'd been aware for decades that the low and slow launch requirements of aircraft flying torpedo attack runs would leave them vulnerable. But the potential payoff had always been considered worth it. Still, if there was a way to mitigate the risk, that was always going to be welcome, and in 1939 development had thus begun on a device known as Torpedo, the brainchild of Sir Denis Burney. This took a standard British airdropped torpedo as its basis, but added a detachable set of wings and a tail to it, the idea being to allow the torpedo to glide down to the water, allowing it to be released from a distance further away that corresponded to the length of the glide path. It could also therefore be released at a higher altitude, and with the launch aircraft going considerably faster. A small paravane that streamed behind and below the torpedo would hit the water first, and that would trigger the wings and tail to break off, leaving just the torpedo, which would fall into the water and proceed as normal. The Mark I Torpedo used wooden wings that were just over 11 feet wide, but it never really worked properly, and so the Mark II was developed. This used metal wings with a 14-foot wingspan, and it at least managed to make it down to the water fairly reliably. A small irony of this weapon's development was that smaller torpedo bombers, such as the single-engined Swordfish, Albacore and Barracuda, or the twin-engined Beaufort and Beaufighter, were the only ones that could actually use it, as they carried their torpedoes below their fuselage and thus wings sticking out didn't really affect them. If anything, it actually slightly lessened the load due to the generated lift as air rushed over the wings. Conversely, large medium bombers like the Wellington, which carried their torpedoes internally, did not have the bomb bay dimensions to fit this adaptation, and they would be stuck in the normal attack profile.
It was calculated that Torpedo would allow a torpedo to be launched from an altitude of 2,500 feet, with the aircraft travelling something between 130 and 200 miles an hour, depending on the launch platform. And it extended the range of the torpedo by about 5,000 yards, which would place the launching aircraft well out of range of anything other than an enemy ship's heavy anti-aircraft guns, which, due to their nature, were far less numerous than the light and medium caliber automatic weapons that were dotting many ships in the early 1940s. It also moved the aircraft almost entirely out of the mutually supporting gun range of ships that were escorting the primary target, unless such an escorting vessel was directly or near directly in the flight path. Unfortunately, there were two big problems with Torpedo. The first was that the glide added additional time and distance to the drop calculations, as well as introducing a section of the run that occurred at a completely different speed, which made working out the deflection angle for the drop considerably more difficult. This was compounded by the fact the enemy was now further away, and thus course, speed, and what exactly it was harder to discern. But the much larger issue was that Torpedo was a simple glider. It had no course correction. If an aircraft was off by even a degree on release, or there was a little bit of an unexpected crosswind, the torpedo would enter the water in completely the wrong place and possibly pointing in entirely the wrong direction. In theory, some form of guidance or self-correcting mechanism could solve this problem, but that would add weight and complexity to the weapon that would likely take it beyond the capacity of the existing launch aircraft which could fit it. Plus, it would be more expensive. Given that, at the end of the day, the unguided torpedo element of Torpedo would be making the final attack run, these improvements weren't considered feasible, and so although Torpedo was still undergoing trials officially when the Channel Dash occurred, it would be cancelled before the year was out. However, the Channel Dash inspired a new idea. Enter then Group Captain William Helmover. He'd spent World War I in the artillery before switching over to what was then known as the Royal Flying Corps, which then became the Royal Air Force. However, while flying was his day job, he was also quite the inventor, getting involved in early aerial refueling efforts in the early 1930s. But, as he was over 40 years old by the mid-1930s, he decided it was time to retire to conduct further research. But this break didn't last for long, as rising tensions in Europe saw him return to service in summer 1939. Although he was judged too old to be a frontline pilot, he was instead assigned to the position of Senior Scientific Advisor to the Chief of Air Staff. Since he'd clearly spent some of his brief retirement in a garden shed, he had adopted certain traits that are common to most British inventors who are left to their own devices for any significant amount of time. This particular trait being the desire to solve problems by application of extremely large developments of existing technology, ideally involving the use of explosives. One of his first forays into the field of wartime technology was the turbine light, a system that was designed to solve the early war problem of aircraft large enough to carry airborne interception radar not being fast enough to catch German night bombers, while aircraft that were fast enough to catch them were too small to carry the bulky radar. His solution was to place the radar on a twin-engined aircraft that could at least keep up with the bombers, but to also replace that aircraft's nose with a gigantic searchlight that was in the same order of power as the most powerful searchlight in the world today. And more specifically, the turbine light was about 1/3 the power of the Luxor Skybeam, except it flew. The aircraft, so equipped, would then track and illuminate the hapless German aircraft in a blinding column of light, and assuming that this didn't immediately blind everybody on board and force the bomber to crash anyway, it would then be a rather easy target for any single-engine night fighters who could home in on the massively illuminated bomber. This scheme did actually result in at least one confirmed kill, but it was overtaken by the advent of newer, smaller, and lighter-weight radar that allowed both radar and guns to be combined in a single higher-performance platform. although some of the work that was done in getting the world's biggest airborne flashlight to function would later be incorporated in the anti-submarine ley light system. Now, however, Helmover resolved to develop a weapon that could be used to sink a ship with near impunity for the launching aircraft. He took some of the issues with the Torpedo project as a starting point. His new system would need guidance to solve the issues with long-range accuracy, but said systems would make the weapon too heavy for a glide launch. If that was the case, then the weapon would have to be exceptionally long-range for a torpedo, and that in turn meant that it would be very large, as it would have to convey itself, its warhead, and the guidance systems over a considerable distance. He therefore issued a memo entitled Suggested Dirigible Water Weapon, with the following description in part. The purpose of this system is to direct from the air, at night under moonlight conditions, a radar-controlled surface craft with upward identification beam against enemy shipping at anchor and other targets. The controlling aircraft would orbit within the area of the reflected moonlight so as to render the target and waterway visible to the operator. The memo then went on to describe how a test flight over the Staines Reservoir, a place that will recur many times in this account, had shown that an aircraft could spot a 60-watt light at 10,000 feet when that light was directed in a cone such that the light could not be seen from the reservoir embankment. Now, although this description might sound very much like a surface craft, by the end of the memo he was also discussing making the device capable of jumping over or diving beneath nets and booms, and therefore it was actually submersible. By late April, correspondence was being exchanged regarding the choice of warhead, and it was suggested that perhaps the new Jeffries 45-inch capital ship bomb might be a useful donor. This bomb was a 5,500-pound device with a 1-ton shaped charge warhead, some fins, and little else. By late June, Helmover was back at Staines Reservoir with 1/10 and 1/4 scale models of his proposed device, with the main purpose of these being to answer some initial questions about buoyancy, surface versus underwater behavior, the center of gravity, and whether you would best use a single propeller, a double propeller, or a contra-rotating propeller. If the warhead was going to mass almost as much as some existing torpedoes, then clearly such a device would be well beyond the carrying capacity of any existing torpedo bomber. But since it would need to be dropped well beyond the range of enemy defensive fire, perhaps this restriction didn't matter too much. In order to give himself the maximum volume to work with, he concluded that his only real size restriction was actually the internal dimensions of the largest bomb bay in British service, the 33-foot long and 5-foot wide cavernous interior of the Avro Lancaster 4-engine strategic bomber. But a Lancaster, flying low to drop the monstrous weapon, would be vulnerable to any potential fighter escort, and these could of course range out beyond even the longest reach of heavy anti-aircraft guns. And so the range would have to be measured not in miles, but in dozens of miles. That wasn't actually a problem in and of itself. The square cube law meant that a torpedo that was large enough to fill the Lancaster's bomb bay could carry a lot of fuel. But it did pose an issue of engineering. Normal torpedoes had to carry both fuel and compressed air, or in the case of some Japanese torpedoes, compressed oxygen, so that the fuel had something to burn in. Even for this monstrous weapon, carrying enough fuel and enough oxidizer to achieve the initial range goal, somewhere in excess of 50 miles, was likely to not be possible, especially as the idea was for the weapon to move at a fair old clip, around about 40 knots, otherwise the target might die of old age by the time it actually reached it. And so Helmover decided that his weapon would be as much mini-submarine as it would be torpedo. Instead of a conventional torpedo engine, he decided he was going to use the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. This was a 700-horsepower monster that would see wider use during the war, sending 28-ton Cromwell battle tanks zipping around northern Europe and jumping canals, as well as being the initial power source for the Centurion main battle tank. But at this point, it was also a useful selection since Meteors were derated Merlin engines, and a number of Meteors could be created from damaged or near life-expired Merlins removed from aircraft, which meant that their subsequent loss in a one-way mission wasn't any great disaster because they weren't particularly useful in any other context. Fuel would be carried in flexible fuel bladders enclosed in metal tanks, so as fuel was used up, seawater would enter the overall fuel compartment tank and keep the weapon at approximately neutral buoyancy. But since the Meteor would gulp air like a madman, Helmover installed his own brand of snorkel, a pivoting tubular mast that stuck up above the waves, and also provided a convenient mounting point for the radio antenna, which was to be used for remote control. An automatic valve would cut off airflow if a wave surmounted this mast, which would also automatically trigger the release of air from one of two onboard compressed air systems, specifically a low-pressure tank which also controlled the gyroscopes, the rudder, and the fins. A much higher pressure tank would then top up the low-pressure one as and when the low-pressure tank's capacity dropped past a certain point. This would ensure that the engine could run continuously, even in rough seas. Another advantage of the Meteor was that, being an ex-Merlin, it was already set up to cope with different levels of oxygen availability and air pressure, as its original use case corresponded to flying at different altitudes, so mild changes in air pressure and oxygen content as the tanks refilled the interior and the valve opened and closed wouldn't pose a significant problem. Now, of course, this mast would create a noticeable wake, so for the last 3,500 yards or so, which was still well beyond the usual maximum range of an airdrop torpedo or the typical launch range for a submarine-based one, the mast would fold down, and the torpedo would then run fully submerged, with the high-pressure tank now continuously open to supply the Meteor with air on its last dash. If the torpedo stayed just below the surface, then radio signals might still just penetrate the water and it could be guided. If it went deeper, then it would simply run straight, and the call would have to be made on which attack profile to use depending on if the target seemed to have spotted the device or not. Also built in was a system that commanded the unit to surface if the air ran out, which would either allow for a periscope depth level second go-around as it came back under control, which would be a truly terrifying prospect for a ship that had thought it had escaped, or else the torpedo could be commanded to self-destruct, a system which would also trigger if the engine ran out of fuel or otherwise expired. Guidance would be provided by a high-flying Mosquito or similar aircraft, which would be merrily cruising at an altitude and distance that again was far beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft gunfire, and hopefully also most combat air patrol fighters, as even those that could reach said altitude would take some time to get there. Time they hopefully wouldn't have in the gap between them noticing the control aircraft was up there, figuring out they should do something about it, and climbing to altitude to find it. Tracking the progress of the weapon would by default simply be visual, looking for the wake of the mast and then the bubble trail of the drive system, with control corrections sent by a jamming-resistant twin-pulse radio system. Backups were provided in the case of the guiding aircraft losing sight of the torpedo in the form of a rear-facing light. Some sources indicate possibly that this was an infrared light, but the early testing indicates that it might also possibly be a cone-beamed regular light, as well as a smoke generator which could be remotely triggered, with coloured chemical trails also trialled at first, although later abandoned. The ability of the weapon to dive or rise on command also meant that it could be used to circumvent defences like anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets or booms. Now, you might be thinking that a 5-ton over-the-horizon remote-controlled torpedo-minisub would be hilariously expensive compared to a normal torpedo, and you'd be right. Moreover, the more weapons were launched at once, the greater the chance of confusion between the guiding aircraft, and the greater the chance that both the aircraft and the weapon itself would be spotted. So you ideally didn't want to have to use more than one of these things to hit any single target. Luckily, Helmover had an answer for this as well. The torpedo would be 1/5 explosive by weight. Instead of the shaped charge from the anti-capital ship bomb, he just installed a literal ton of Torpex, which was 3 to 4 times the weight of the average torpedo warhead, and thanks to the additional explosive power of Torpex as compared to TNT, this meant it was about 5 to 6 times as powerful as the average torpedo. It was even twice as powerful as the otherwise monstrous charge found in the short-range version of the Long Lance. In fact, it was about as powerful as the warhead that was found on the much larger and heavier Kai-10 suicide submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy late in the war, which this torpedo both outpaced and outranged by a considerable margin. So you didn't really need more than one, as a single hit would blow straight through any known torpedo defense with more than enough power to spare, and pretty much anything short of a full-size battleship would probably end up just being blown clean in half. Stone and Company were enlisted to produce prototypes, the first of which was a 7/10 scale model that started life as a regular 18-inch torpedo. Luckily, there was a nearby RAF base where torpedo bombers were being trained, and so one was duly acquired. At the same time, a full-scale dummy version was also begun. The 18-inch torpedo conversion would be used for initial testing, and the full-scale mock-up would be used to double-check aero and hydrodynamic results from the tests to make sure they matched the full-size version. The system was now dubbed Helmover, which was often hyphenated in letters as apparently its sheer destructive potential had some reading the name as Helmover. A second 18-inch torpedo was adapted for control by what were termed supersonic waves, although if this meant ultrasonic signals for control transmissions underwater from a ship or a submarine, or potentially fitting some kind of sonar-based homing device, is not entirely clear. Now, of course, aircraft don't tend to do very well when actually in the sea, but in addition to the primary device, which was 38.5 inches in diameter and 29 feet long, Helmore also proposed a larger, almost 50-foot-long version that weighed in at around 9.5 tons and would have a range of 150 miles, which could be launched from ships or strapped to the back of a submarine. So presumably this alternate ultrasonic control method was for that variant. It was then decided that the weapon would be constructed in 3 separate sections. A forward section, which would contain the warhead, and was initially quite cone-shaped, but after further testing of the adapted 18-inch torpedo prototype, which was aimed primarily at resolving issues with hydrodynamic shape, stability and depth keeping, the final version had a blunter head, similar to that found on modern torpedoes. The central section contained the compressed air tanks, the mast aiding hydraulics, the fuel, the controls, radio gear, and an anti-roll gyroscope. The aft section housed the engine, the control surfaces, the depth-keeping equipment, more gyroscopes, this time for general stability, the propellers, which were a contra-rotating pair, and an exhaust. The Meteor engine itself would be water-cooled since, well, there was plenty of that around and it wasn't like salt incrustation was going to matter, and there was even a small bilge pump fitted to dispose of any water that might leak in to the device for any reason, including if the snorkel valve didn't work perfectly, as the air intake in the mast ran all the way down to the keel of the torpedo, so any water that did manage to sneak in would run straight to the bilge pump and couldn't foul up any of the electronics. Although the specifications for the airdropped version called for a minimum 50-mile range, it was suggested that up to 100 miles might be possible, depending on currents, sea conditions, and if a radio-controlled throttle was installed, how fast the engine was run. Unsurprisingly, these tests and construction of prototypes took some time, especially in the strict secrecy that was imposed on the project. So strict, in fact, that many of those who might otherwise have championed its accelerated development, such as the men who were tasked with attacking turpits, had no idea it existed, which resulted in the project being allocated a high, but not top, priority. Still, in May 1944, A fully built but inert version was launched into the Solent from a Lancaster flying at 145 miles an hour and at an altitude of about 107 feet. Despite belly flopping into the sea, it remained intact and was retrieved by a small motorboat and dragged ashore, where it was confirmed that everything inside had in fact survived the impact, and, if it had been fueled up and ready to go, the weapon would have worked. Although it was noted that production could begin in as little as 3 months' time, a more leisurely pace was adopted, in part for the secrecy reasons just mentioned, and also in part because the only worthy targets at this stage were Tirpitz, which had just completed repairs following the X-craft attack sometime previously and was due to be struck by various air raids in the more immediate future, and the Japanese fleet, which it was anticipated was probably still going to be around to launch weapons at for some time to come. The dummy test unit was then made fully operational while new devices were under construction, and in February 1945 it was sent back to Staines for further testing. This was generally successful, apart from one test where, in lieu of a control aircraft, a small boat had been equipped with a transmitter. All was well until they noted that the giant torpedo was heading right for the boat, which had been used as an aim point. The torpedo was heading at them at full speed and seemed singularly unwilling to listen to instructions to turn. Facing either complete annihilation, or merely the craft being smashed in two, depending on if somebody had primed the warhead or not, the small team aboard got up in preparation to abandon ship, only for the Helmover to immediately turn away from them. It transpired that one of the crew had been sitting on the transmitter's aerial, and his attempt to exit the craft meant that the aerial, being released, was now signalling just fine. On the 4th of April 1945, a demonstration was held for the Secretary of State for Air, the Minister of Aircraft Production, and the Chief of the Air Staff. The giant weapon worked flawlessly, and soon an order for 100 Helmovers at a cost of £1.5 million was placed. This would put each torpedo at around £15,000, or about 50% the cost of a brand new single-engine fighter plane at the time. The order emphasised that these weapons should be made available as soon as possible for use against Japan, with an anticipated delivery rate of 8 per month once production was fully up to speed. Further tests in August using the prototype utilised both a Mosquito and a B-25 Mitchell as control aircraft. The aim was to try and keep the control aircraft at least 10 miles from the target. It was found that the distance before the wake of the device became invisible to the observer depended quite a lot on the direction and angle of the sun relative to the torpedo, the sea, and the aircraft. In the best combination of conditions, a distance of 10 miles or more could easily be kept. In average conditions, a distance of about 7 miles was more typical, and in some cases, when light conditions were pretty poor, a range of just 4 miles was about as far as you could be away from it and still see sufficiently to guide the Helmover properly. However, being that even this distance also still involved flying at high altitude, the control aircraft was still well out of range of anything but the heaviest of anti-aircraft guns. It was found that the B-25 was actually a better control aircraft, as its slower cruise speed meant that it could fly a more leisurely figure of 8, and the larger internal volume of the fuselage meant that the various gunners stationed behind the pilot could also provide feedback as to the device's course and speed if the aircraft had to turn away for any reason, whereas on the Mosquito they had to rely purely on a forward-placed observer in the nose. There was also some discussion of exploiting the larger size of the B-25 to mount an air-to-surface radar on it, with a radar reflector then installed in place of the light on the mast of the Helmover, which would allow for approximate directional guidance to be given based purely on radar returns, which could of course be then done from considerably further away, and, strictly speaking, potentially out of line of sight, perhaps on the other side of a cloud, with the aircraft then sweeping in at high speed for a final visual check and any needed fine-tuning of the weapon's course. As well as this, there was some talk of supplementing the guidance system with either a passive acoustic homing system or an active sonar-based guidance system, which would also reduce the risk to the spotting and control aircraft as the Helmover closed in on its target. But despite a successful series of further live tests, the surrender of Japan saw the order reduced to just 12 for post-war development and testing. And then in September 1945, when it was realized there were no real prospects of enemy capital ships in the near future, the whole project was scheduled for cancellation. However, a final reprieve appeared possible for a while when somebody pointed out that the weapon may have a more widespread future by adapting one or more of the new autonomous homing devices that had been in use by all sides in the last month of the war, and, of course, this being a project led by slightly eccentric British scientists, also replacing the one-ton warhead with an atomic bomb, which they concluded would negate any minor inaccuracies that these early homing devices might have had. But unfortunately, this didn't generate quite enough support in the upper echelons of power, and the Helmover project was finally cancelled for good in early November of 1945. Although, interestingly, the disposal notes refer to a number of systems developed for the project being farmed out to various research establishments for further work. This included the disposal of 9 near-complete production models and both the initial prototype and a second test prototype, all of which were dispatched to destinations unknown. Today, the only publicly available evidence of the project's physical existence, beyond the various documents from World War II during its developmental stages, consist of a sectioned scale model which is held by the RAF Museum.